Thank you very much, Tamar. I'm Katherine Fennelly. I know many of you, others I'm looking forward to getting to know. We've changed things a little bit on the agenda just to be sure you were all awake and paying attention. And what I'm going to do is to make just some very brief remarks about the work of the task force, and then we'll have a response from two local leaders that will give us, I think, some fruit for further discussion from all of you. So I'd like to begin by highlighting the importance of the report, but I probably don't need to spend much time on that with those of you who are fellow members of the choir, so to speak. But what's really striking is, I think, the importance of this topic. I teach on immigration here at the Humphrey School. I do research on immigration, and it's frustrating, but it's constantly invigorating. I don't think there's a day that goes by when there isn't some headline that has to do either directly or indirectly with immigration and the need for immigration reform. And many of those headlines, I think, the general public doesn't realize have a connection to immigration. The constant discussion of things like the aging population and how we're going to be able to provide services to an increasingly a larger proportion of people who are retired and who are elderly, and a smaller number of people who are working age. In the Midwest, if you look at population decline, we're aging more rapidly than the rest of the nation, and so it's particularly acute here. And the question is, how do we rectify this dependency ratio issue, meaning the proportion of people who are in that prime working age who are supporting those of us who are getting close to or who have retired? It's a real issue, and it's one that almost no one would deny is important, and yet it isn't paired frequently enough with immigration. And I think that's one of the things that this report does, is it reminds us that many of the important social issues that we're facing, the questions of social insurance and how we're going to be able to afford it, have in fact a portion of their solution in immigration, because there's really only one way to have a younger labor force, just one, and that is through immigration. We're not getting younger. We can raise the age of retirement. We can all continue to work until we're 90, but to have a younger workforce, there is one and only one solution. I think another thing that is very important is the ways in which this report reminds us to try to reframe the issue and to talk about immigration as an asset rather than a problem. It's not easy, but it's perhaps the most important thing that we can do if we're going to further immigration reform. We used quite a bit of data in this report, and I want to show you something that my students and I developed. Pardon me? Oh, it is on? Okay. And this is a resource that I hope you will utilize. It's going to be on the website of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. And if you want to access it immediately, you can find it at the Humphrey School on, if you look under Humphrey School and then Fennelly, which is my name, under writing samples, there's a link to this report. And we developed this in a graduate seminar. It's a database on immigration and the region's future as part of the task force. And what we did was, we have, if you look at the sidebar, we've got a summary report on the Midwest, and then we have individual state reports. And so if you are interested, for example, in data on Minnesota, then what you can find for Minnesota and for every other state is a summary of immigration history. For example, the idea that, or the fact that we have a larger percentage of immigrants who are refugees than any other state, and we continually have, and that accounts for some of the diversity within our our foreign-born population. So we have some of the history of immigration, we have demographic characteristics, we have assimilation or integration data, Receptivity, we've got a summary for all the Midwestern states of the various laws that have been passed pro or anti-immigration. And we've got labor force data, which is, of course, particularly important since the focus of this task force is on immigration and the economic future of the Midwest. So I hope that you will think of this as a resource that you can use if you are trying to make the case for immigration reform, which we hope will be the result of this seminar. If you are writing a grant proposal and need background data on the most recent statistics on immigrants in your state or in the Midwest, this is meant to be a resource for that. And I'll just open one of these briefly to show you. For example, if you wanted to see labor force data for Minnesota, we start out with the percentages of foreign-born workers, or rather the regions of origin of foreign-born workers as of 2009. We've got the percentage of foreign-born workers in Minnesota and in the US in 2009 as well. These are the latest census data that are available for these particular topics from the current population survey. The top industries of foreign-born and native-born workers. We compare things like the unemployment rate in the state compared to other Midwestern states, and the projection for increased need for workers in Minnesota in the future. I'm not giving you time to look at these because what I want to do is to tease you into going yourselves and looking at the data. The size of the Minnesota labor force by nativity, and the growth. Now here I will stop for 1 second because one characteristic of all of the Midwestern states, including Minnesota, is that our numbers of immigrants compared to the major receiving states are small, but the growth in the foreign-born population is more rapid than it is for those traditional gateways for immigration. So we also have a full copy in PDF that you can well, you'll see it in the sidebar that there's a way to print the entire report if you'd like a hard copy. So please do utilize this data source. And as I say, the website will soon be featured on the web page of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. This report is going to come out right after the November elections. And it's being timed in a way that we hope will stimulate the new president and the newly elected members of Congress and some of the older remaining members of Congress to make immigration reform a priority. And if you support comprehensive immigration reform, I think Tamar's words about incremental reform are perhaps, as she said, the most controversial part of this subject. And it's one, I mean, as we look at what has happened with deferred action for young people recently, where some of us were hoping to see the DREAM Act passed, which would give permanent legal status to young people who had been in school here or in the US military. And as you know, deferred action is really a postponement of deportation. It doesn't accord permanent legal status to those young people. I'll be interested to hear comments about incremental reform of that sort versus waiting for something that may be impossible to achieve. I don't know, comprehensive immigration reform, because I have mixed feelings about it myself, I must admit. I hope for the more permanent reform because this deferred action that could be reversed by any new president or by Congress in the future is problematic, and yet I also see the hope in the faces of thousands and thousands of young people who are lining up to at least have these 2 years of freedom from the fear, the likely fear of deportation, no guarantee. So it's a really interesting aspect of the report, and I can see the arguments on both sides. But regardless of that, I think the most important, for me, the most important aspects of this report are the ways that it makes a strong case for the urgency of immigration reform, I would say comprehensive immigration reform, for the Midwest, for Minnesota, for the well-being of the state, not only for the kinds of reasons that we often hear, which are, it's the right thing to do or out of humanitarian impulses, but because in this case, the argument is that it's an economic necessity, and I think it makes a very strong case for that. So without going further into this, I would like to invite two local leaders to come up and to comment on the report, and then we're going to open it up for your comments and discussion. Bill Blazer is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Business Development at the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, and John Keller is the Executive Director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. So, John and Bill, please.